Welcome to the podcast, a conversation about history, memory, and the landscapes that continue to shape how we understand power, culture, and identity in the Great Lakes region.
Across what is now Michigan and Ontario, a network of military forts built between the late 17th and mid 19th centuries once structured the political, economic, and cultural life of the region. From early French trading posts like Fort St. Joseph in the 1690s to British and later American garrisons such as Fort Lerneau in the late 18th century and 19th century installations like Fort Wayne and Fort Wilkins, these sites were never just military outposts. They were hubs of diplomacy and cultural exchange deeply embedded within long-standing indigenous landscapes.
These forts are the current subject of the exhibit at the Colonial Grosscup Museum of Anthropology at Wayne University, founded in 1958 by Dr. Arnold Pilling and named after the first curator, Professor Emeritus Warren Grosscup. The museum has moved locations several times, but since 1997, it's been located on the first floor of Wayne State's Old Main Building, the oldest historical campus building located at the intersection of Warren Road and Cass Avenue. The museum can be accessed via the eastern entrance of Old Main off of Cass Avenue.
The museum houses rotating exhibits, which in the past have included topics such as Arab American cultural traditions, archaeology of everyday life in early Detroit, cosmologies, the art of origins, Maya textiles, mythical foundations and material consequences, the art of religion in West Africa and the Caribbean, and the science of culture, as well as many, many more.
Long before European powers arrived, places like Detroit, known to Anishinaabe as Wabiakanog, loosely translated as After Shores, were vital gathering grounds, and to this day, we recognize that the land that Wayne State rests on is Wabiakanog. At Fort Wayne, located along the Detroit River, archaeological and historical evidence points to continuous indigenous presence stretching back thousands of years, including burial mounds between roughly 7,500 and 1,280. These were not peripheral spaces. They were sacred, lived environments for nations such as the Anishinaabe, Wyandot, Miami, and Potawatomi peoples. Fort Wayne offers guided tours for anyone interested, with one of the most well-known landmarks being the tombstone of Peter Audrain, within one of the storage rooms in the interior of Fort Wayne. Audrain was the first American citizen of Detroit in 1796, arriving in Detroit at 71 years old.
When European empires established forts across the region at sites like Fort Michilimackinac, Fort Mackinac, and Fort St. Joseph, they did so not in isolation, but within existing indigenous trade networks and political systems. These forts became critical nodes in the fur trade, shaping alliances and intergroup relations. In many cases, particularly under French control, these relationships included intermarriage and cultural exchange. Under British and later American authority, however, forts increasingly became instruments of territorial control and displacement of indigenous peoples, especially in the aftermath of conflicts like Pontiac's Rebellion and the War of 1812.
Other forts, like Fort Gratiot and Fort Drummond, reflect this transition. Built during moments of geopolitical tension, they reveal shifting imperial strategies and, importantly, the erosion of trust between indigenous nations and colonial powers. By the early 19th century, forts were no longer just spaces of exchange, they were tools of expansion.
Today, what remains of these forts varies widely. Some, like Fort Mackinac, are preserved with original structures dating back over 2 centuries. Others, like Fort Michilimackinac, have been meticulously reconstructed through decades of archaeological excavation. Still others, like Fort Drummond, exist only as partial ruins visible through foundations, cemeteries, and other material traces left behind.
But perhaps the most important question is not just what remains, but what was taken. The history of these forts is inseparable from the disruption of indigenous communities, including the disturbance of burial sites, the removal of cultural objects, and the long-term displacement of native peoples. At Fort Wayne, for instance, the destruction of burial mounds during 19th century construction, and the later storage, rather than return, of indigenous artifacts, sparked protests from native communities well into the late 20th century.
This is where contemporary conversations about cultural repatriation become critical. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, passed in 1990, established a legal framework requiring institutions to return human remains and cultural items to affiliated indigenous nations. NAGPRA is not just a policy, it represents an ongoing effort to address historical injustices embedded in places like these forts.
Institutions such as Wayne State University play a key role in this work. Through archaeological research, archival study, collaboration with indigenous communities, scholars are working to better understand the layered histories of the Great Lakes region, not simply as colonial frontiers, but as indigenous homelands with enduring cultural significance.
To explore these themes more deeply, we turn now to Fort Michilimackinac, one of the most extensively studied and reconstructed sites in the region. There, ongoing excavations continue to uncover the daily lives of French traders, British soldiers, and indigenous communities who lived and worked in and around the fort.
In the following interview, we speak with Dr. Lynn Evans, Curator of Archaeology of Mackinac State Historic Parks, about what these excavations reveal and why they matter today.
Without further ado, our interview with Dr. Lynn Evans. So first of all, thank you so much for being willing to meet with us and talk with us. It's really going to help a lot with, getting info from an expert who's actually doing work for the state and at the sites to add to our project. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah, so what many students don't know is that on Wayne State campus, we do have an archaeology exhibit in one of the classroom buildings that focuses on Fort Wayne, Fort Lynn, Fort Gratiot, Fort St. Joseph, Fort Michilimackinac, Fort Mackinac, Fort Drummond, and Fort Wilkins. We wanted to talk to you specifically about Fort Michilimackinac. So for people who are unfamiliar with the site, how do you describe the historical significance of Fort Michilimackinac in the Great Lakes region?
So Michilimackinac is actually, well, the Straits area in general is one of the oldest settlements in Michigan of Europeans. The first European settlement is up at Sault Ste. Marie, but St. Ignace, which is just on the other side of the bridge, was second, and Michilimackinac, and then Detroit. And then Michilimackinac was next, I think. And so it was actually originally settled by the French. It was first the missionaries were here, and then the soldiers came. But the whole point of being in the Straits region was to access the fur trade. So because of where we are at the junction of Lakes Michigan and Lakes Huron, the Anishinaabe have been here since the glaciers receded, and they would come, especially in the summertime, to fish. It is a marvelous place to spend the summer. And there were some people who lived here year round, but for many of them, they had sort of this pattern of where they went from season to season. And I think of them as sort of early snowbirds. They're going where the weather's nice. And so when it's nice up here, they're here. They come in the spring, they do maple sugaring, they fish. So there's all these people who are here. And when the first explorers come through and they see all these people, and the missionaries find out and they say, oh, there's a concentration of people, let's build a mission. And so they build a mission. Then the soldiers say, oh, look at all these people, and they're doing fur trade and they're doing other things. And so we're going to come make sure that taxes are being paid and the laws are being followed. And that's how it all gets started. So the first Europeans on this at Michilimackinac were French Canadians. And they were here from 1715 until 1760. And the fort grew remarkably in that time. By the 1730s, there were actually more civilians living here than soldiers. So that was the case for most of its history. We call it a fort. It was a fort. It was run by the military, but there were always more non-military people here than soldiers. So that's kind of a weird setup. And so that's the first thing. So as a result of the French and Indian War, there were no battles here, but as a result of the fall of New France, then Michilimackinac was taken over by the British. So the French knew that, they left, the soldiers left in 1760. The civilians stayed. The Articles of Capitulation said that the civilians were allowed to stay and keep their property, both their small things and their real estate. They were allowed to keep their religion, which was a huge deal in the days of the established church. They could stay Catholic, even though they were now going to be British. The only catch was they had to swear allegiance to George. George II was the king for a very short time that the British were here, and he died very quickly at that point. So for most of the time, it was George III. And for these people, many of their families had already been in North America for several generations. The king was a pretty abstract thing across the ocean. It was pretty easy to trade allegiance to one king for the other if you could stay. Many of them had family ties in this area. By this time, they'd married into some of the Odawa and the Ojibwa tribes up here. And so they stayed. The British were marching to come take possession of their new fort. They got stuck in Detroit. They spent the winter in Detroit and came up here then in the spring of 1761. the fur trade expanded, the fort expanded. They actually moved outside the fort also. There was a little, they actually used the word suburbs, which I had no idea was an 18th century word, but it is.
Wow.
And so everything was all hunky-dory until these pesky colonists over on the seaboard decided to start a revolution. And so between 1779 and 1781, the British actually dismantled Michilimackinac, moved over, built Fort Mackinac. They convinced the civilians to move also. They wanted to keep an eye on them, but they didn't want them in their fort anymore. And so they said, if you move, we will help you move. They put things in His Majesty's sloops and sailed them across the straits. They helped them move things across the ice. They said, if you move, we will help you, and we will give you grants of land on Mackinac Island. And they did. This is a case where the government made some pretty big carrot kinds of promises, and they kept them. And so when the Americans do eventually get up here in 1796, they honor those deeds. And so some of the original lot lines on Mackinac Island go back to this period, to the Revolutionary period. There were never any battles here, but soldiers and militiamen from here went out to New York, they went down to Kentucky, they went out to Illinois. They were very involved in the Revolution. But the biggest impact it had here was the transfer of the garrison from Michilimackinac and the establishment of Fort Mackinac. So that's why it's important. Historically, that's its significance in terms of the history of our state and of our nation. It goes back before either one of those. And then in terms of the project being significant, we've been doing archaeology here every summer since 1959. So it's one of the longest ongoing projects of its kind in North America. So we're very proud of that, and that makes it pretty important too.
Wow. Thank you for that. I had no idea exactly how many times it switched hands between the Americans and the French and the British. And also like just that there was so much going on with, I knew it was like a hub of trade, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's a complicated history with lots of people involved there, for sure.
We're talking about Michilimackinac, but I know your exhibit is Fort Mackinac too. So there's a little bit more to the story.
Right.
So the British move in 1781. And they know by 1783, they realize that the war is over and this is going to be American territory. But they don't want to give it up. It's still very lucrative. And the United States is not really very strong at that point. And so the British stay in control of it, even though it's technically American, all the way up till 1796. And it's not until after the Battle of Fallen Timbers, after the Jay Treaty, all these things happen that the United States has a strong enough military to actually take possession of their territory that had been theirs for 13 years at that point. So then it becomes American, and they come in and they fix up Fort Mackinac because the British had just maintained it at the most basic level. They knew that they were going to have to give it up eventually. They keep it right up until the War of 1812. And the first land action of the War of 1812 is actually the capture of Mackinac Island by the British. They had only gone as far as Fort St. Joseph, not the one down in Niles, if you're familiar with that, but there's one on St. Joseph Island, which is in the St. Mary's River, which connects Lake Superior to Lake Huron. They find out first because the way news travels is by people, and their messengers get to Fort St. Joseph before the American messengers get to Fort Mackinac. So they come down, they sail down, they land at the point of Mackinac Island that's called British Landing, and they march up, they get to the high point, they point their cannon down, and when the sun comes up, they send a message to the commander of Fort Mackinac and said, "We're at war, we have a cannon pointed in front of you, we have 200 native allies with us, what do you want?" And they say, okay, he doesn't really have a choice. They surrender the fort. The British hold it through the entire war. The Americans do try to recapture it. That's the only battle that was ever actually fought in the Straits, was the battle for Mackinac Island in 1814. But the Treaty of Ghent says everything goes back the way it was. And so, as the commanding officer of Fort Mackinac said, with one stroke of the diplomat's pen, everything we fought for is gone. And the Americans come back in 1815, and it's been U.S. since then. But there's one more little wiggle wobble before we get there.
Right. And is it right that the British also moved from Michilimackinac to Fort Mackinac on the island after U.S. independence? Is that right? That they jumped over to Mackinac Island?
No, they
Um,
did that during the war, and so they
okay,
were there by 1781. And then they go up to Fort St. Joseph. They come back in the War of
okay,
1812. They briefly go over to Drummond Island, and then they find out because there's some question about exactly where the line is, because the people who were mapping this out in Paris did not necessarily have the best maps at hand. And so there's on Drummond Island very quickly. And then they go to Penetanguishene, which is over in what's now Ontario. And there's apparently still a naval base there. Like there has been a military presence. You can draw this line all the way through that goes to that I think it's a naval presence at this point.
wow. Thanks for
Yeah.
clearing that up. That's really interesting. Yeah. Um, is there anything that makes Michilimackinac and Fort Mackinac, I suppose, like especially valuable in understanding um, interaction between the Europeans and the native presence in the area? Is there anything regarding the fur trade or evidence that we can find that uh, like brings those relationships to light?
Especially at Michilimackinac, it does because that was the whole point, was to manage the fur trade, to keep peace. The commanding officer of Michilimackinac usually hit like his number one thing on the list was keep peace with the native groups, keep them happy with us, keep them happy with each other, because if they're fighting each other, they're not harvesting furs. And so for both of the forts, the documentary record is full of that sort of information. And so that's one way that they're important. And then for Michilimackinac, the archaeology is also important because those things were taking place in the fort. The fur traders who were living there, the project that we're working on right now, it was a fur trader's household. And so those things are happening there. And one of the things that we've really been more and more focused on in the last 20 years or so, 25 years, is trying to tease out where we can see the native presence within the fort, because technically no Native Americans were allowed to live in the fort, but many of these traders had native wives. A lot of the traders had enslaved people, almost all of whom were Native Americans rather than African Americans. There were a few African Americans here, but the vast majority of them of the enslaved people were Native. And so trying to tease out their presence as best we can. And that's one of those places where it's just super complicated, because everybody's using, for the most part, they're using the same basic material culture, but they're using it in different ways and they're understanding it in different ways. And you can sometimes see the use, and it's much more difficult to figure out how somebody's thinking about an object. But we're giving it a try. We're doing the best we can. But yeah, so that's why it's so important for this, is because it's a place where all these different groups came together and we're interacting with each other on a daily basis in many sorts of ways, in family ways, in government to government ways, in business relationships, in church relationships. The mission eventually moves down to La Croche and then down to Harbor Springs. But there's a parish church there, and there are, some of the Native people are also, they're baptized Catholic and function in the Catholic Church. They serve as, they're baptized. Some of these women serve as godmothers. And so it's this incredibly intricate web of family relationships, religious relationships, business relationships, government relationships. And it is all happening, in this relatively small plot of land.
Right. And I imagine an intermingling of certain cultural elements too, right? Like you just described with the church and obviously the material culture going across and between the different peoples who were there, and things being shared between all those groups, right? The remnants of the French and the British and the native communities all intermingling and sharing bits of their culture.
In the French period, there's this sort of Richard White wrote a book about it called The Middle Ground, and he really talks about how this sort of new culture that's not any one of those, but but involves parts of all of them, develops and is quite a thriving thing, especially before the Americans get there. Because the Americans come with the idea of settling, and the British come more, and the French come more with the idea of, yeah, we're going to extract these furs here. They're using more of the old mercantilist model that this is a colony that we're going to extract goods from, and they're going to buy things from us. But when they came out here, most of them weren't thinking about living here permanently, and so the middle ground was more based on those kinds of relationships than they were based on exploitation rather than exploitative colonialism instead of settler colonial.
Right.
You know
Yeah.
what I'm trying to say.
Yeah,
That word is
colonialism,
not
yeah.
going to work
Yeah.
today.
That's okay.
How do you think the introduction of European goods altered indigenous practices?
So where in places things that were obviously useful were adopted pretty quickly. So that's things like textiles, because up until the Europeans, well, I shouldn't say that. So up until they had access to European goods, which does happen before the actual traders get here because of the trade networks. But there were some things that were readily adopted. Textiles, they're just so much easier. It's easier to make clothing out of wool, especially, than leather. Copper pots are much more portable, much lighter, easier to make. Up to a point, guns they're more effective weapons, but it takes a long time until they have access to people to fix those weapons and buy the ammunition. And so that's something that comes sort of in the second wave. And so there are some things that were, there was obvious utility to them, and they might be modified. There's a whole article, I can't remember who wrote it now, but he talks about the lives of a copper pot and how it has all these different functions and uses and things. So just because something's adopted doesn't mean it's used in exactly the same European way, but there are some things that were very popular, that were the most common thing in the fur trade that was coming from the European side, when you look at the trade records, is actually textiles. We think of guns and knives and beads because those survive today, and the textiles, generally speaking, don't. But when you actually look at the quantities and the monetary value, they wanted textiles. That was the big thing.
Did you say that the textiles were woven, knitted, more European style textiles rather than the traditional native garments that they had been producing for thousands of years?
Mostly been wearing leather, furs, animal products like that. And so so these woolen, especially a lot of woolens, there's linens, but they switch over pretty quickly to, and not that they give up leather. Like moccasins are so practical for this area that many of the French wear moccasins too. They're like, yeah, this is such a more efficient way to be. And the voyageurs adopt leggings and things. So there is still this cross-cultural mixing, but in terms of just everyday garments, they're much happier to, and they are still making some things in their styles, but using European cloth. So
Right.
they're not trading for pieces of clothing, they're trading for bolts of cloth.
Okay, I see. That makes sense. Since we know they were using some of the materials Europeans brought over, and we know Europeans were, extracting furs and labor from the native peoples, were there any ways that the native communities leveraged alliances with the forts, with the French and the British, to further their own interests among other native communities?
Sure.
Do we know anything about that?
There's a couple different ways that happens. One of the ways that happens is that the further that some of the tribes position themselves as middlemen, and the Adawa were particularly known for being traders and businessmen, and merchants, not the right word, but traders, I think, is the right word. And they would try to keep some of the further Western tribes from having actual contact so that they could be the intermediary, we'll take your furs and we'll bring you back things, and they're getting a cut of it. So that's one way that they're using the leverage of having these people settled right in their area. Another way they're doing is, and there's a book called Masters of Empire, highly recommend it. They're playing the French and the British off against each other as long as they can, and they totally see this bigger picture. Like, you know, many years ago there was this stereotype of the ignorant savage, and they were not. They saw that these people were rivals. They used so they played them off against each other. They used them to further their own causes. You see this especially, you know, so in the mid 18th century, the British are very much aligned with the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, and the French are very much aligned with the Huron, and that's an ancient clash. I mean, that's older than the French and the British, but it was, you know, it was the same thing. They were able to say, you know, that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and so that, yeah, they used the French British conflict to further their own ends and to help take down their traditional enemies as best they could. So it's this incredible network and interrelationships.
Definitely very like complicated relationships going on there, for sure.
Yeah.
To what extent did the fort serve as a space of cooperation? Like, how did they use the fort specifically?
So the fort was the gathering place. It's that my favorite word to explain it. It was an entrepot. It's a place where all these people are coming together. They're exchanging goods. They're exchanging ideas. In some cases, they're, you know, becoming marriage partners. They're creating alliances, and so it did work. Like, it, you know, I've been talking about the conflict part of it, but it was a thriving place in the 1730s and 40s, and again in the from 1765 to 75. That was sort of a golden age, and you know, people had sort of worked things out. Like, it's never perfect, but there was this equilibrium where, you know, everybody was getting something from it, and there was general peace, and a lot of the negotiations to make that happen were happening at the fort. Some of the actual trade was happening. Some of it, the traders come in and then they go back out. But this was the place where everybody was coming together to try and create something that would work for everybody.
Wow. Yeah, so despite all of the different alliances and the competition, they still would all congregate at the fort and do business with each other, basically.
And
wow.
Also these councils where they would, you know, call in leaders from, so that they would send out wampum belts, as they would send a belt with a message and come, and we're going to, you know, that try to keep peace among the Lakota, some of the groups that we think of as Sioux, but you know, they knew there were different people there, and bring them all together to maintain peace. And that was I said, but I'll say it again because it is a really important point. One of the main things that the commanding officer at Michilimackinac was always charged with was keeping peace with and among the native peoples, and he would do those things at Michilimackinac. We still don't know. They refer to a council house. We don't know exactly what space that was, where exactly in the fort that was happening, but we know it was happening at Michilimackinac. There's a lot, you know, because that's such an important part of his job. There's lots of letters about those kinds of things as they send letters back to General Gage, and as those letters get sent back to England. So there's a lot of correspondence about it, and so we know a lot about that aspect of it because it's well written, and it's written in a language that we can still read.
Right. Was there any changes in the relationships between, or the social structures in native communities because of the nearness to the forts and to these European trading posts? Was there any change after the Europeans kind of came in and brought their presence and the fur trade and everything?
I don't know as much about it from that angle, but I would say there has to have been some because it was fairly common on the European side for European traders to marry native women. And the French actually encouraged that. They saw that as a way to increase Frenchness. Now, the British had different ideas about it. They were more hung up on racial differences in a way that the French were like, if you'll be Catholic, you can be an equal partner in all of this. And so there's some differences there, but there have to have been some. You can't have that much intermarriage without it creating some changes, but I don't know exactly what those would be. You would have to talk to other people about that.
Thank you.
And going back, we've talked about excavations have been going on since the 50s, right?
1959.
Are there any specific artifacts from Michilimackinac specifically that you think are like super important to understanding Native and European interactions with each other?
It's hard to pick one individual artifact, but when you take them all together, because we have a lot of things we know were used as trade goods. We have beads, and we don't have the cloth, but we have pins and scissors and thimbles and things that went with the cloth. We have things that we know were being made specifically for the trade market, things like tinkling cones, trade silver, things like that. We have, what else would be specifically for interaction? We do sometimes find, we found some so we find things that the Europeans found useful. We find bone harpoons. That's something that they would have found useful. Some of the things they found useful don't survive. I mentioned moccasins already. They certainly adopted native foods like maple sugaring. We found one piece of one birch bark macaque, but that's another thing that just doesn't survive in the ground. And then when you look at another place that shows up is a lot of what we find are food remains. We find lots of animal bones, some burnt seeds, things like that. And so you see, certainly there are some European things. We found some pig bones, we found some chicken eggs, but they're also eating local foods, and they're learning that from, especially from their native wives. And so you find a lot. Well, the French were particularly excited about passenger pigeons because in France, pigeon's a delicacy, and all of a sudden you come to the New World, and in the spring when the migration, anybody can eat pigeon, and they eat a lot of pigeon. But you see the reliance on fish. You see that they're learning which berries are edible. We find these charred seeds. You find things like rabbits and squirrels, which native women would have been snaring. So you see it in the diet as well.
Right. Since we started excavations at the Straits of Mackinac in the 50s, was there any archaeological find or any artifact that changed how we understood the sites in a significant way, or has it been a pretty consistent view of these sites?
So the forts were fairly well documented in terms of how they were laid out and everything. But one of the things that happened very, very quickly. So they started in 1959. At that point, they were aware of 3 historic maps that all date from between 1764 and 1769. And we've since discovered a French one that's earlier. But they had these maps. And so Moreau Maxwell was the archaeologist in charge, and he said, okay, I have an idea of how the fort's laid out. I want to start in the middle and get an idea of the stratigraphy first before we get into a building, because that'll be complicated. Well, feature 3, so it's found pretty darn quickly, is the barracks, which is a building that was built after all of those maps were drawn. It was probably started like literally weeks after the last one was drawn based on what we know about its history, but immediately. So here's a thing that we did not know that now we know. The barracks is right in the middle of the fort. I don't know if either of you have ever been up there, but when you walk in, like it's just right in front of you. So that was a big thing. In terms of really changing things, No, I don't think we found something that made us say, oh my goodness, this whole idea is wrong, because we knew the basic history of the fort. But a lot of the nuances, a lot of the daily life things like that really get fleshed out. How much intermingling there was, how much when you start looking at a household's diet, how that plays out, you can tell a French household from a British household. Some of those nuances. The other thing that we've really picked up on is how sophisticated some of the people who lived here were. I mean, they were officers and gentlemen and rich traders, and they had some very, very nice, fashionable things. And that's something that starting out, we didn't know. In the 1950s, it was, people thought about mountain men and all that stuff.
Right.
And that's out in the Rockies. That's not here. But these weren't just crude guys. Some of the people here were very educated, and very rich, and their lifestyle, they wanted as best they could to replicate what was going on in London, in Mackinac City, which, was a challenge, but they did a surprisingly good job. And the other thing, it's hard to say because the archaeological research has continued and the historical research has continued at the same time, and we feed off each other. We don't have that big a staff, so it's a constant thing of the historians are learning this and the archaeologists are learning that, and you get you have new questions, and that's true. Just in general, in both the field of history and the field of archaeology. And well, historical archaeology is newer. The Society for Historical Archaeology wasn't actually founded until the 1960s. So our project is older than the society. But so some of the things that have changed have just been a reflection of the questions we've asked, and that's true in any academic field. If you say what questions did we have in 1959 and what questions we have in 2026, society's changed. We ask, I think, for sure, different and definitely more interesting questions than we did then, more complicated questions.
Right, and it helps that we can base our new questions on what we've already learned. Right. And
exactly.
Especially, like you mentioned, with historical archaeology, because you're at sites that have a historical record, you can kind of bounce off each other and use the history and the paper records to inform the archaeology and vice versa.
Right. And then the third leg of that stool is, and it's something, this is a very new development, but looking at the oral histories of the Anishinaabe, as a third source and a third insight. And so some of the questions you ask, I think, would be better answered by their historians.
Right.
In terms of like the social structure changes and things like that.
Yeah.
But we look at, we try to look at all three legs of it.
Mm-hmm.
Something that's really important in studying Native American culture is making sure you stick to the NAGPRA Act, which is the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act. Mm-hmm. For our class specifically, we went to the Detroit Institute of Arts, and they specifically highlighted current Native American artwork and their stories. Is there a way that we can make Native American culture more accessible to people who think that it's something of the past, or like we don't need to care about it?
So what we have done, and we've been doing this probably for over 25 years now in some ways. We've tried to bring in Native interpretation. We have outside the fort walls, we've built at different times different structures, but mostly Waganogans and Nasaogans, winter houses and summer houses. And we've hired people from the Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa, which is the local tribe. They were here then, they're still here. That's like their number one thing, that if you're going to talk about them, say that. And so they come and they talk about, we're still here. And this is what we were doing then, and this is what we're doing now. And so we have, and it's challenging to sometimes find people to fill that role. It's a very difficult role because they are, sadly to say, people say the most awful racist things to them sometimes. but so it takes somebody with incredibly thick skin and passion. But we've been lucky enough to have some of those people over the years. And so that's been our attempt, is to actually have Native people on site talking about what their role was, what their role is. We've tried to we've worked on the island. We redid the Biddle House, probably 10 years ago now. I don't know, time flies. Not quite, right around the time of COVID, because it got messed up by COVID. So 5 years ago. And when we reinterpreted it and reimagined it, we worked with the tribe, and we're telling the story of the treaty era. And so we've got a whole bunch of video things that we did with elders of the tribe, where they talk about some of their stories and some of the impacts. And that's one thing we did. We also worked with and there were some people from the Sioux Band involved in that one too. We've worked with tribal members to, we have on Mackinac Island, the road that goes around the outside of the island, which is one of the things, if you go to the island, one of the things that, a must do is to ride your bike around the outside of the island. We've put in, I think, 6 or 8 informational little rest stops where you can pull over, we have benches, and then we have a panel talking about the native experience on the island, and different, some of them are historical, some of them are more recent, but their beliefs about the island, because Mackinac Island is very important to them religiously and spiritually. And so they talk about that. So that's another way we're trying to share that story. So we've done different things at different sites, but we are trying to do that. When we redid our orientation video at Michilimackinac, probably about 8 years ago now. And so, you have the usual talking heads. So I'm talking, our retired curator of history is talking, our director at the time, but we have a tribal historian come, and they're also a talking head, just like, just like the rest of us, talking about, again, their perspective on the history of the Straits area and all. So we've tried a lot of different ways, and we're continuing to try to figure out, ways to do that, to partner with the local tribes, to incorporate it into our various, we do interpretation a lot of ways, and how we can make that more visible to people, and let them, not just know what was going on in the past, but let them know what's going on now. That this is they're very much a part of the history and today's story.
Right. Are there any findings from the Straits area that need to be part of repatriation to the native communities, or the Mackinac State Parks doing any work in repatriation?
There were, especially in the 60s, there were some human skeletal remains recovered. Some of those have been returned to the tribe. Some of them were from a cemetery that was mixed population. And so we worked with the tribe and the Catholic priests those were not repatriated through NAGPRA, but they were reburied with both cultures represented. But I think as far as we know, like when the law came out, we tried to be on top of it and do our inventories and do our consultations. And so,
Okay.
Barring, you never know what you're going to uncover, but we think we have done, in terms of, that, for particularly our, the human skeletal remains and the associated funerary objects that were in the first wave. We believe we have fulfilled our obligations there.
Okay, gotcha. And to start wrapping up here, is there anything about Fort Michilimackinac, Fort Mackinac on Mackinac Island, that you think people should know, or you think would interest people about these sites and really spread awareness of why they're important to study?
So 2 things. So the first thing that I really want to highlight, and that's, I know, part of what you guys are doing with your exhibit. I got to see it when it opened when the SHA was there, and it's great. It was awesome. We're very, very tickled with how it came out. But one, just especially with everything going on with America's 250, I would like people to know that Michigan has a place in that. This is a Revolutionary War site. Both of them are. One ended because of the revolution, one started because of the revolution. So it's important, and now's a great time to learn about it. And we've got some events and things. We have a website, www.mackinacparks.com, and that will have our special events. And the other thing is just to let people know that if you come to Michilimackinac in June, July, or the first half of August, you can see an archaeology dig happening. We are right there in the middle of the park. There's just a little chain separating people from the dig. For a lot of people, it's the first time they've ever seen an actual archaeological excavation. You see it on the internet, you see it on TV, you see some version of it in the movies. If you want to see the real thing, and the chances are somebody's going to find some little thing, a little bead or a fish bone or something while you're there. It's a rich site. But it's a great opportunity that is not something that you can just, it's something you can't do in Detroit. You can do a million things in Detroit you can't do in northern Michigan, but for the most part, visiting an archaeological site, I know you guys have done some things, and Wayne State's right at the forefront of that, but this is a place you can count on it. So come visit
Awesome.
us.
Yeah, thank you again, Dr. Evans. We really appreciate your time and the information you could share with us about the two forts up there.
Those are my two takeaways.
Okay.
Come visit us, and we're
Yes.
a Revolutionary War site.
Well, it's been forever since I was actually at the fort, so I'm going to have to do that again soon.
Yeah.
So.
Come up and see us. All right, this year, our project is supposed to start, I think, June 1st through August 22nd. So.
Okay, perfect. Thanks everyone for sticking with us for that amazing interview with Dr. Lynn Evans. We hope you learned something from our podcast and that it inspires you to visit the incredible Gordon L. Grosscup Museum of Anthropology at Wayne State University. Additionally, we hope it brings awareness to the ongoing research being conducted on life in and around colonial forts in Michigan.
If you're interested, remember that you can always visit the excavation at Fort Mackinac during the summer dig season.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks for listening.